Hi, I'm Shell.
And I'm Susan. Welcome to EduBuffs,
where you will find tips for teachers and help for your students.
If you haven't already, click that little red subscribe button down below as well as the bell next to it so that you get notifications when new videos pop up.
Yes, we would love that, and we are on all the socials.
All the socials. Links in description box, or look up the handle at EduBuffs or at EduBuffins. What are we doing today, Shells?
Well, we're still doing the student experiment.
Still doing the student experiment. There's a lot to do in a student experiment.
There's a lot. It's a very complex assessment type, and I found that students really need support with breaking down all the aspects of it.
So let's break it down just a little bit further today.
We will do that. Just that.
And so what part are we breaking down to today?
Today we're going to have a look at modifying the method.
Okay. All right, well, let's give it over to Shells, who's going to take it away.
Thanks, Suze.
Before we consider the methodology, I just want to remind my lovely students that you have far greater value than the grades that you earn. I am going to be talking a lot about the marking guide and about how to get the highest marks. But please remember that the most important thing is that you learn, that you feel safe and secure, to try your best, to make mistakes, to get up and to try again. Right, let's have a look at this methodology. The marking guide section that you need to refer to is research and planning. There are 3 criteria that get assessed in the methodology. First of all, you need to have justified modifications. You need to have a methodology that will collect sufficient and relevant data. And thirdly, you need to have considered risk management. Justified means to give a reason. So you want to be giving a good, solid, scientific reason for every single one of the modifications that you have made in your planning of this investigation. And remember that as you present your modifications, they need to be detailed enough that somebody else could take your prac and do it again, just following what you have written. So justified modifications in detail and with a reason. Sufficient means enough for the task or adequate for a task. So you want to plan to collect data that will be sufficient. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. So you want to plan to collect the data that is adequate to answer your research question. Relevant means you're going to be able to use it to answer your research question. The third aspect is a considered risk management. Considered means well thought through. So you need to include aspects of risk that you've carefully thought about and say what the risk is, and you need to also say how you have managed them so that the risk is minimized.
You're rolling.
Let's get down to that methodology then. This section of your scientific report is fairly straightforward in its structure. You can begin it with a little subheading that says methodology. You then need to include a hyperlink to your original prac, the class prac that you modified to create your investigation. In our scenarios, we are basing our student experiment on a class prac where students looked at the effect of the time spent on aerobic exercise and the heart rate of students. It is important that you include a hyperlink so that the examiner can find the original to look back at it. The next section are your actual modifications, and again a small subheading does not go amiss. Remember that your modifications need to be detailed. Anybody who wants to attempt to modify this investigation in the same way that you have done should be able to follow your instructions and do exactly what you have done. So detailed, and they also need to be justified. In the previous videos, I encouraged you to look at 3 different ways to modify your methodology. They were redirection, refinement, and extension. If you haven't seen the previous videos, I do recommend that you take a look at them so that you fully understand the context of this video. In the modifications, I encourage my students to write the type of modification that they have used. And remember, this is a scientific report. If you're not sure about how to use different tenses, stick with past tense. Can't go wrong with past tense in a scientific report. And you want to be using passive voice, but more about that later. So we've put in our modification and we've included some detail about the equipment that we've used in place of the equipment that was used in the class prac. We haven't justified it yet, and I'm going to put that justification in a different color. The justification needs to be as scientific as you can make it. This modification was made so that we could address the changed research question to look at the effect of exercise time on the blood pressure of students. What I've written here is a start, but it's insufficient. You should actually make mention of what the dependent variable was changed to so that it is completely clear why you have changed to measuring the blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff. The second modification that was made was a refinement. We decided that instead of looking at high school students, which could have a range of ages, we would limit our investigation to looking at 16 and 17-year-olds. We also decided to only test girls because gender might bring in another extraneous variable. So that was a refinement. So our modification number 2 that's our refinement, And now we need our justification. We made 3 modifications to this investigation. The third one was an extension. We decided that we were going to test 10 subjects at each condition. We decided to test 10 subjects instead of 3 because these are people. People have different genes and they have different levels of fitness. We can't control those extraneous variables, but by having a larger number of repetitions, the effect of outliers will be a little less, and so we will get a more valid result in terms of statistics. We need to put that in as our justification. And we finish the sentence. In the research and planning, you have to demonstrate that you can plan to collect sufficient relevant data. In research and planning, you have to demonstrate that you have planned to collect that data. And then in the collection of the data, you have to demonstrate that you have collected sufficient and relevant data. If you plan to collect sufficient relevant data, and you run out of time and don't actually manage to collect it, you still get marks for planning it. If, however, you don't plan to collect sufficient relevant data, you get no marks for collecting sufficient relevant data because you didn't plan to collect it in the first place. So it's really important that you get this aspect of your planning right because it counts twice. Sufficient means sufficient to answer the research question. So the important thing that you should keep going back to is, what is the research question? The research question in our scenario talks about the effect of time of aerobic exercise on the blood pressure of 16 and 17-year-old girls. So then once you have established that, and I can't emphasize this enough, you should be able to write down your research question without looking back any time. You need to now determine whether you're looking for a trend, a relationship, or a comparison. Now you might be looking for more than one of these. You might be looking for a trend and a relationship, or a comparison and a relationship. Either way, I'm going to address them separately. It's important when you think about a relationship in biology, this is particularly for biology, and probably for marine science, whenever you are investigating living organisms, there are many things that we cannot control. We certainly cannot control every single extraneous variable. So because we can't control the genetics, the diet, there's so many things, we need to make sure that we have a sample size that's big enough. So we need to make sure that we have sufficient repetitions so that the genetics or the diet or whatever it is that we can't control has minimal effect on our mean. In school, it's difficult because we are limited by the time that we have. So I would not suggest going more than 5 trials unless your methodology is really simple and you can get through them really quickly. So I'm going to say recommend more than or equal to 5 repetitions. That's going to be sufficient to minimize the effect of the extraneous variables that we're unable to control. Now I want you to think about a trend. A trend, if we think about it as a graph, is going to be, how does the line go? Does it go up? Does it start at the left and go down? Maybe it's a bell curve. If we just have 2 points, you will always get a straight line between them. But you've got no way of knowing what happens between those 2 points. If this was an enzyme and this was temperature, it might look something like that. But with only 2 points, you cannot establish a trend. So again, because of the time constraints, I recommend more than or equal to 5 conditions. That way, we are going to pick up if it does something like that when we put in the line of best fit. If you've got a comparison, you're comparing 2 things, maybe 3 things. In the example that we've based this scenario on, we might want to compare the change in blood pressure in boys who are 16 or 17 years old and girls who are 16 or 17 years old after 10 minutes of aerobic exercise, for instance. So we've got a completely different scenario there. Now we're not going to have 5 or more conditions, we're only going to have 2. This will allow us to do more repetitions so that our data is rock solid. One last thing about planning to collect sufficient and relevant data. The teachers are required to find evidence of that anywhere in your report. But you know what? You can make it easy for them. Make sure that in your modifications you say how many repetitions you have, and it's really clear in your methodology how many conditions you have. If you have the same number of conditions as the original prac, as we did in our scenario, you don't have to repeat it, and you shouldn't repeat it. You won't get marked down, but it does mean that you have used up extra words. The last little bit that can be used to earn marks in this section is the risk management. So let's have a quick look at risk management. Again, it doesn't go amiss to have a heading or a subheading because it just focuses the marker's eye on exactly what to expect there, and your marker doesn't have to search for it, which makes it easier to find where to give you marks. There are 2 things here. You need to consider the original risk assessment. If you have not changed anything that will alter the original risk assessment, you do not need to have additional risk management. So if there is nothing new, you are going to say and that's sufficient. You need to have a risk management that's considered. This tells us that you have looked at the risk management of the original and you've come to the conclusion that nothing's changed, and therefore the original risk management was sufficient. No changes were made, so you don't need to introduce anything new. In our scenario, we did have a change. We used blood pressure cuffs instead of handheld monitors. So we do have to indicate that there is a change in the risk management. Now, it's important that you identify the equipment or chemicals that have changed, the risk that is brought in with those equipment or chemicals, and how you're going to make that risk less. So our equipment was a blood pressure cuff. The problem with blood pressure cuffs is that they squeeze your arm and they cut off the circulation in your arm, and it can actually be quite painful. So I need to put that in because that is the risk. So here I've got the equipment, here I have got the risk, and now I need to say how I'm going to make that risk less. We call it mitigating the risk, but we don't need to remember that. The equipment, the problem, and how I've reduced or managed that risk. And that's it.
We hope that video was helpful to you.
If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment box below, and Shells will likely get back to you as soon as she can.
I would love to do that.
One day I'll get back to comments and on videos as well, when it's more on my expertise side. If you haven't already, click that little red subscribe button, share with all of your friends, because we all know the saying, sharing is caring.
And we're all about the love.
That's right. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.